All right. Thank you all for joining us again to this month's second post of this TSST event, or the Tackling SAP Security event. I see that people are still joining, which is great, but I do believe we can kick it off. So, of course, after some demand from different followers, they wanted to repeat the Tackling SAP Security together. This session will definitely also be recorded, so you guys can also have a look at it later. As you guys can see from the event topic today, we will be looking into the SAP security in the new compliance era. And before I introduced our guest, of course, who will be supporting us and be guiding us through these different areas. Just as I said, the recording will be available. Please, once you have any questions, either post it or at the end, we will open up for some questions. It will definitely be available on our YouTube, LinkedIn channels, so feel free to also check it out and share it with your colleagues and organization. And to head start, I would like to introduce Barry Frank, founder and managing partner with TechTrust. I am going to give him the floor to introduce himself. Just a couple of things from my side. Wasim, as you can see my name, I'm leading the advisory or security advisory here at NoMonkey. We are trying to provide organizations with that necessary know-hows around SAP security, whether it is by doing technical assessments like penetration testing, or doing SOC enablement, where cybersecurity and information security people need to understand how to identify and detect SAP events or alerts and understand them in areas where, creating different use cases, playbooks, and incident response. So there are different areas within advisory that we are supporting organizations. But I think enough about myself. Without further ado, Barry, welcome, and thank you again for doing this for the second time with us for the Tackling SAP Security event.
Great. Thanks, Wasim. You might see a little bit of extra facial hair today.
Yes.
I'm participating in Movember, so I'm growing some facial hair in aid of men's health. So if you want to contribute to that cause, you can contact me afterwards. But that's not the focus of today. Today we're looking at compliance and SAP, and I have 30 years of SAP experience, so I've been around a few blocks, and I've also started focusing on board governance and governance around SAP systems, which is really important, especially around cybersecurity. And that's what I'm bringing to you today, to be able to bring that SAP cyber and regulatory and compliance angles all together. And it's a pleasure to work with NoMonkey. I have worked with some of the leaders for many years, and now it's a chance to actually bring together some of the auditing, regulatory, compliance aspects together with the great work that NoMonkey is doing already. And I have the privilege of actually representing NoMonkey in Switzerland. So if you're in Switzerland, you can reach out to me, and I can also help you access the best solutions and services through NoMonkey in Switzerland. So
Absolutely.
Without any further ado, I'll hand back to Wasim.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for the great introduction. And definitely it's an exciting time also for us to have Barry represent NoMonkey in Switzerland, especially when it comes to one of the areas that we're going to discuss today, as his experience with the different Big Four has made an impact on different organizations across the world. So it is a great pleasure to have you supporting us as well, or have you representing NoMonkey with TechTrust. I like to usually start with different with some myths and misconceptions when it comes to SAP security. I did add, so that list is actually now growing. I did add one of the myths and misconceptions, which Barry is going to explain, especially around it, which is the last one that you see there. But just to give a quick overview of these myths and misconceptions. When we are talking about zero trust, I want to keep reminding people that, or reminding organizations, when you are talking around zero trust is not a product. There's no product that will allow you to implement something called zero trust. Zero trust are different processes, different tools that you put in place to actually add more defense layers, or not just defense layers, but add more protections toward whether it is the SAP environment or not. So I'd like to keep that, even though it doesn't just apply to SAP, but I feel that there's a lot of misconception when we are, doing some sort of activities around zero trust. So it is not a product. It is basically some sort of methodology to enable you to actually increase that security posture that you have. IAM and authorization, or identity access management and authorization. Yes, SAP security it's a big thing in SAP security, but it's actually not the only thing. And I have been in this area where, SAP security, when people are talking about SAP security, the first thing that they jump on is that, so you guys do roles and authorization, or segregation of duties. While it is, as I said, a big thing, it's not the only thing. Your systems your SAP system has more areas to look into when it comes to threats, or when it comes to security best practices. One area where I see a lot of also mistakes is that the controls or security controls are only enforced on a production. Here you need to understand that your staging levels also might produce or might have a risk on your production system, because anything that passes along, whether it is transports, whether it is creation of different users, whether it is testing different interfaces, it starts with your other staging levels. So if there's no proper mechanism to stop anybody from jumping or doing some sort of privilege escalation through RFCs or anything, that enforcement of the production controls will not actually save you at the end of the day. So while you can be lax in certain areas, but still there are mitigating controls to consider for the different staging levels or the different environments when we are talking about SAP systems or protecting them. And the moving forward around the SAP basis teams here, we definitely it's like considering IT professionals. IT professionals do sometimes patch systems, do take care of controls that are coming from security teams, and you need to think about SAP basis teams exactly like that. They are not the professionals who would understand what to do when it comes to security. They would patch it, they would update it based on, I don't know, a technical assessment that has been done, but they are not the ones who will take care of security of your SAP systems. And one area here where SAP is isolated and not published, this is just insane. And then you start asking these questions. All right, so if your SAP system is isolated, does it have interfaces? Yes, sure, it has a lot of interfaces. Does it have custom code? Does it have third-party integrations? And then you'll start to understand that while it is in an isolated network subnet, while it is not published, there is certainly a lot of different interfaces that can introduce further attack vectors, or your attack surface then starts to increase by the minute that you start implementing those different areas. And one of my favorite, of course, SAP is German made, so it is definitely secure by default. So while SAP does a good job recently in defining SAP security baselines, it's still the customer's requirement, or customers requirements to actually implement them and enforce further controls. So yes, it's German made. Is it secure by default? That's isn't the case when it comes to different SAP systems. And I'm going to leave the last one for Barry, as he has provided us with this last security myth for you guys so we could start kicking off that presentation.
Okay, we're going to be taking you through quite a few different regulations and frameworks, and we wish it was as simple as complying with one would ensure compliance with all of them. But unfortunately, we have regulations coming from many different places, from industry regulators, from the US, from the EU, from Switzerland, if you're based in Switzerland, and you will need to comply with each and every one. And they unfortunately do not have one rule covers all. So we'll talk a little bit later about how you might have a framework that tries to match as many compliance requirements as possible. But compliance with one set of regulations is never going to be enough.
Absolutely. Which takes us to different areas of the presentation here, or for today's event. So we do want to, from Barry's perspective, of course, and from the experience, is to ask ourselves, why is SAP at risk here when it comes to compliance, or does it affect SAP systems in general? What kind of regulations and frameworks are we talking about here when it is going to be applied to my organizations? What are these regulations that have been released? What do we need to take care about? And then, of course, your familiarity with those recent compliance requirements, and how do they apply, not just, of course, from a perspective of SAP system, but how do they apply to your organization? And finally, the responsibility. And I think this is a big subject when it comes to responsibility, is to understand those different roles and responsibility when it comes to whether it is around the frameworks, whether it is around the regulations, whether it is around, when there's an incident happening, who's responsible for what. And I think, Barry, I'm going to give you the stage to dive into these different topics with us today.
Okay. So we will answer as many of those questions as possible. There is also a training course that you can buy through the No Monkey Academy that will take it into greater detail. So I'm mentioning that right now, but we will cover at a certain level as much as possible. I wanted to start with a perspective of what can go wrong. And SolarWinds was a few years ago, and it was a great example because it not only showed that things can go terribly wrong, that the systemic risk is pretty great, but it can also show you that the actual consequences reaches the board level, which is the important message for today, is that you're no longer in a small isolated capsule. Everything you do has systemic risk and systemic impact upstream and downstream. And we see with SolarWinds, it was in the news a few years ago, and we thought it was over. And now we see that with SolarWinds, there is another round of court cases coming about. More organizations are actually being fined by the SEC, so the consequences are pretty expensive. So we see that the SEC is now fined Avaya, Unisys, Checkpoint, and Mimecast, and the fines range from $950,000 to $4 million. And the reason why they are being fined is because of sloppy and misleading incident reporting. And we're going to be speaking a little bit later on about the requirements of the SEC. But many of the other agencies and regulators also have requirements, and we'll touch on that as well. And you don't only need to consider what happens in your own sphere of influence. As I mentioned the word systemic risk a few times, you need to know what's going to be the impact. And when I presented this particular session a few weeks back, we joked and we mentioned that nothing has really happened around CrowdStrike yet. And
Yeah.
the next day in the news, the CrowdStrike lawsuits are starting, and there's
Yes.
going to be a lot of fallout from that one.
Yeah, it was actually like after we finished the first session, and then I started looking at the news. It really clearly answered our questions on whether or when are they coming, which you actually announced or addressed, that it's not about if they are or whether people are going to start suing, but if it's the matter of time of when they're getting sued. So
Exactly.
absolutely.
So now we look at why are SAP systems at risk? Why do people even care about the risk here? And it's always good to have a little bit of research to back that up. So if we look at PwC, we see in their recent Global Trust Insight survey, 36% of businesses have experienced a data breach that resulted in more than $1 million in losses. So that's pretty big. And if we go into very specific analysis talking about SAP, 5 million average yearly cost of business disruption due to SAP specifically non-compliance.
Wow.
We go to the next one. PwC, 79% of executives will increase their cyber expenditure in 2024. So at least there is some recognition that more needs to be done. And lastly, we have EY mentioning that 84% of companies take more than a month to detect cyber incidents, while 63% take more than a month to respond. And I've had a client not too far back who didn't even know about it for 2 years.
Wow.
So, the perpetrators found a backdoor, were in the system, were moving freely for 2 years before anyone actually picked it up. So, and that's unforgivable in these days. So you need to have that. And the buck in the US now stops at the board level. And that's why I've been focusing on board governance around digital, cyber, and other technology related, including AI. So the board has to be responsible for that. They have to have the right skills. Unfortunately, there is a US organization called the Digital Director Network, where directors are being prepared to either come from technology and have those skills already in place, and then being topped up with board governance skills as well, or we're also training directors to understand technology better. Gone are the days where you had no technology knowledge in the boardroom. They would roll in the CIO for a 10-minute update and say, is everything going well with those flashing lights in the data center? And he would say, thumbs up, everything is good. And then he would leave for another year. Now the board needs to be really understanding what the risks are. They need to understand what's happening, and the buck stops at the board level.
Absolutely.
So if we look at the threat landscape, this is also answering the question, why is SAP being targeted? So first of all, most companies are running a lot through SAP. Some companies are running everything through SAP. So access to crown jewels, you have your customer information, your product information, your bills of materials, your supply chain information. Everything is right there in one place. So if someone can get in, they can do a lot. And they have all the information, even if they're just going to expose it publicly. Salaries, everything is there. Lack of foundational security hygiene. A lot of people are not thinking about these systems. They're not thinking about, securing this in the proper monitoring and security concepts that we're used to. And there's a wide attack surface. because SAP is supposed to be a collaborative system. One of the Americans, and I must say this is an American definition of Swiss cheese, said that SAP is like Swiss cheese, you know, the cheese with big holes. If you live in Switzerland, you know that that's not really what Swiss cheese is about. But still, in the American definition of Swiss cheese, you want to have those big holes. You want to let as many people in and out as possible. And at the same time, you have to have security. And then we have this gold mine for feeding criminal motivations. So corporate espionage, you have all the sensitive data there. And some people are just attacking for notoriety because they can get into a big company. And sometimes it's these hacktivists that want to prove something. So they hack into a multi-billion-dollar company just for the fun of it and being able to post that they've done it and maybe did some mischief along the way. So that's just to name a few.
Quick question here, Barry. I do get that a lot. So with the complexity of SAP systems, do you think it's something in favor of the organization because it's too complex? Nobody is trying to attack it and nobody understands it, or because it's too complex, there's a lot of different attack surface and attack vectors that would definitely be interesting to look at?
I think there is a lot to be interesting to a perpetrator. And I think that it's not in the news. A lot of companies are not actually admitting that they have been hacked. And that's dangerous as well. And I know that there is a picture in the No Monkey marketing material that shows some horror stories, but there have been companies that have been hacked. And I can't mention the name of the company, but I had a client not too long ago where someone was fired in the basis team, and on his way out, he deleted the production system and the backup.
Wow.
And that left quite a hole in business resilience and operations, business continuity that needed to be covered. And these things happen. So you need to have all of this risk mapped. And we'll talk about the risk management a little bit later on. So here we have a few concepts. So target relevance, the exponential growth of the SAP ecosystem. And now you have many moving parts, and they've purchased a number of things from different vendors. So you might even have a few security weaknesses just in the way that systems interact with each other. You also have a lot in the cloud, but you have clients that have things on premise still. There are security gaps as well. So you need to start to think about that because it's a fairly wide attack surface. Warfare strategy, I think these type of systems will become an easy target unless you know how to protect them. Supply chain attacks, we've seen that as well. So increasing interest in disruption to supply chains. And then I mentioned already this these hacktivist groups that are actually quite interested in getting some notoriety as well. And sometimes it's just the kind of green organizations trying to do something naughty with a company that they perceive as not doing the best for the environment, for instance. So a few
the hacktivists.
Yeah, exactly. So here are a lot of acronyms, and we're not going to cover them all right now. We're going to dive into some of the important ones. As I mentioned, there is a training course available, which will take you much deeper into some of these. But the most important thing for you to note right now is there is a lot, and it's popping up all the time. It's popping up in different jurisdictions. And when you're a company operating in several different parts of the world, you may need to comply with several of these everywhere that you actually operate. And we've seen recently that in India, for instance, there is the addition of data privacy laws that require certain additional compliance activities where data is actually in India or Indian data is actually used. So you also need to consider things like that. I wanted to give you a practical example because when I presented this last time, people said, oh, what does it actually mean? And a lot of these regulations are new as well. So last month, NIST 2 came into operation. Now, those of you that don't know NIST 2, it's actually the Network and Information Security Directive. It's the second part of it. So this is the European Union cybersecurity regulation, and it actually came into being, I think, the 27th of last month. And now you actually have to comply with this, and you're thinking, what does this mean for an SAP system? So I've spelt it out a little bit for you so that you can follow along here. So you first of all need enhanced cybersecurity. So you have to improve your access controls, encryption, patch management. Incident reporting is going to be a common topic throughout all regulations because most of them require incident reporting. NIST 2 is all about infrastructure, critical infrastructure. So you're going to see supply chain security, third-party security, whether it's software or vendors. And then you have to have regular risk management updates. You have to apply a risk management framework, and you also have to have audit trails and regular audit steps as well in some of the requirements. So this does actually add quite a lot to what you need to do. So you need a framework that can actually cover as much of this as possible, and we'll mention a few frameworks along the way. So which ones relate to an SAP system? Unfortunately, most of them do. Are the requirements all the same? I've answered that question already. I wish that they were. Unfortunately, you know, NIST 2 is a European Union requirement. CERCIA is the equivalent in the US, and they're not equivalent. They are actually two different requirements, and they have different reporting requirements, etc. So what do you need to report to whom and by when? We're going to dive into some of that right now. And if you look, average 10 to 15 requirements or regulations and frameworks out of a possible 90. So that's the average, 10 to 15. Depends on how many countries you operate in as well. You may also have to comply with many different local requirements. And any time that the third party is involved, the risks are 13 times greater because of systemic risk. So your third party, you're hoping that they're doing everything right, but you're ultimately responsible for them as well. And we'll show you an SAP example because a lot of people are thinking right now, well, I moved to SAP in the cloud. So SAP is taking care of everything. I don't need to worry anymore. And if life was that simple, we'd all be very happy, but it's not. So we'll get into that in a little bit of detail as well. Hopefully this is making sense to everyone. And this too has significantly added to this. So we start to see quite a few requirements around food, around postal and courier services, just to mention a few, and it adds quite a few sectors. Here are the key considerations. I've mentioned systemic risk a few times already. I can't emphasize that one enough. Unfortunately, we're not isolated. Everything that happens in one place or one organization or one process has a knock-on effect to others. And you need to think about that. Shared responsibility, we'll talk about the SAP example a little bit later. And that's how we share responsibility with our vendors, our service providers, companies that we actually collaborate with as well. Board accountability, the buck stops with the board. And we were hoping the US SEC would go a little bit further in actually mandating that there needs to be a technology expert on every board of directors. They didn't go far enough as far as some of us are concerned, but they did actually emphasize the importance of it. So we made a few positive steps. Regulatory developments, you actually have to have someone thinking about this all the time, because in your risk management, you have to have this all mapped out. People, process, and technology. People are often the biggest problem, the weakest link. So you need to start thinking about that. You need to think how it affects processes, and then the technology comes in. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everyone.
It definitely does. When we are talking about board accountability, is the EU also responsible for, or organizations who are sitting in the EU responsible to assign, let's say, a tech representative within the board at the moment, or is this only in the US?
In the US, it's not a full requirement.
Okay.
But companies operating with good governance are doing it anyway,
Absolutely.
because it doesn't make sense in the same way that until Enron happened and Sarbanes-Oxley came into being, there wasn't a requirement to have a finance expert on the board.
Wow.
And we know how that worked out. Now we're saying, by the same token, you have to have a technology expert on the board. You need to have someone who understands, can interpret for the board what they need to do, and answer any questions, speak the language. That's very important.
Makes sense.
Here is legislative landscape, and you can see here that the US has a lot, and we don't have the dates here, but you also see that most of it's coming in as we speak. This year, last year, and next year are going to be crucial, except in Switzerland, because Switzerland tends to follow the others. So the Swiss have a new Data Privacy Act, which somewhat works the same as GDPR, but does have some differences. It's had an internal control system for a while, and that's something that's quite important to bolster, and also Swiss Code of Obligations. But if you start looking at the US, you see a whole lot of SEC regulations coming. Department of Homeland Security. I was listening to a presentation by someone from the NFL, and the Football League in the US actually falls under Homeland Security because it's where crowds gather. And everything that they do, therefore, has to follow a completely different set of requirements. And we see that with the critical infrastructure as well. Federal Trade Commission has a lot to do with trade and data privacy as well. We see healthcare, we see financial services being covered. We see the equivalent that I mentioned for NIST, which is the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. That's just coming into place now. The credit card, PCI, it's been there for a little bit of time. And then you have a whole lot of state requirements as well, which makes life even more complicated. The European Union, I mentioned this too, but we can also see the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. GDPR has been around for a while, but not everyone's got it right yet. Digital Markets Act, Digital Operations Resilience Act for the financial services, that's DORA. That's also something that all the financial service companies are currently dealing with, and some of those are on SAP as well. Most insurance companies are on SAP. So we need to start thinking about all of these together. Here are some of the key frameworks, and the best thing to do is actually put together a framework, and several of the big four have a framework that's more comprehensive. So it actually mixes and matches several of the requirements, because you're trying to do it once and to comply with as many as possible. Otherwise, if you have 15 plus frameworks, you're not going to be able to do them separately. So you're going to look for that common denominator. You're going to put together something that's fairly comprehensive, and you're going to try and have one framework to cover as much as possible. But here you can see SOC 2 as well, even mentioned here. Try and put as much as possible together.
From these frameworks, Barry, do you consider any of these frameworks at least as a starting point? We did say that one does not enable you to apply, or one is not enough when it comes to different regulations. But do these frameworks, at least to start with one, would you consider anything from this list that might be based off of different regulations?
Well, if you start to look at cybersecurity, then you're thinking NIST, because that is something that's giving you a good focus into cybersecurity. But you're always going to have to add a little bit more to that. And if you look at the big four frameworks, and I've worked with a few of them, they start with NIST and build on that. So COBIT has COBIT, you probably know from ISACA, is also a good framework, and you can start to mix and match and supplement and complement as you go along.
Absolutely. Even in NIST, within SAP, to expand on it, that framework we created, well, not the framework, but the matrix that actually that also tackles or addresses different SAP operational areas. This is how we try to also map it out with specifically the NIST cybersecurity framework, when it comes to understanding it from different departments, whether it's a cybersecurity audit and the SAP areas, so we can integrate those with SAP components like access, like customization, like integration. So it does enable us to translate that in a better and effective way for other areas to understand it.
Yeah, and I've also seen as AI starts to enter every part of the business, and we see AI fully into several SAP processes as well, there is a new ISO standard framework specifically for AI, and you might want to consider that as well. Yeah. So risk management is key as well. And if we go to the next slide, and we can see the change the exercise. So gone are the days when you used to have an annual risk management process where you got everyone into a room and you took out last year's risk register and you dusted it off and you kind of figured out if everything that had been written in pen still applied, and you would scratch off the ones that no longer applied, and you would add the new ones, you'd put it back in the drawer, and you would revisit it next year. Unfortunately, this needs to be a continuous, real-time and integrated process. And it needs to go all the way to the board level. And the board should be insisting on understanding every single technology risk, cyber risk, including what is actually happening in SAP. So that's crucial. You need to change that exercise and have that integration. You also need to start thinking about RACI a lot more. As we're talking about systemic risk, RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So that's the level of engagement, if you like. And if you start to think about cloud computing, you have this misconception that if anything's in the cloud is, first of all, safe and not your responsibility, is the second point. That's not true. You are accountable for much more than you know. And we'll talk a little bit about how that looks in SAP in a moment. And then you have to align the responsibility. Risks can be greater where the responsibilities are misunderstood. And if we take you through an SAP example, I think it's going to come home to you. If we look at the next slide, which is the RISE Private Cloud Edition. So we're going with private cloud, a public cloud. This is probably going to look very different. It's also a point of view because you can configure service providers differently. So I'm giving you one standard private cloud point of view. And if we start looking here, the red is managed by SAP and the black is managed by the customer or the system integrator. You can even have a middleman in between where you don't actually do all the administration yourself. So this could get more complicated. But if you start looking and thinking about it, and I know a few clients that are actually going through this process of trying to understand how SAP RISE is actually working, then you start to think about each of the critical functions under each of these particular circles and how they're divided up as well. So this is the highest level. It gets much more complicated than this.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I just wanted to give you an example. And I think, Wasim, you were mentioning a 30-page Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, yeah.
That...
Yeah, there is quite an extensive document on what the responsibilities between the customer, between SAP, if it is managed by SAP or an hyperscaler, but and of course it breaks down to like even to what, for instance, as an example, severity level of a SAP security node might be responsible for SAP or from a customer's perspective. So it really does go down to that level, and I think few customers that I know actually are aware of such document. It is really long, but it does provide with a good overview of the different responsibilities. And then you see that even if you are, as you said, going to the cloud, the responsibility does not just vanish from the customer side. It actually, while some areas do become under SAPs, but not to the extent that has been addressed here.
Yeah, and we were going through an example this morning with public cloud.
Absolutely.
And you even lose a little bit of control there, as in the public cloud, you can't do a penetration test, for instance. Well, not easily. You can do it, but you have to ask SAP, for instance, for permission to do that. And it becomes a little bit more complex, and you need to adapt your control procedures accordingly.
Absolutely. Especially when it comes to the public cloud doing pen testing, yes, you need to get approval from SAP for each customer or for each client that wants to do a pen test. It's twice, I think, a year for whoever is doing a pen test. And of course, there are restrictions. Like it's not for the infrastructure that is there. It is not cross-tenant or cross-client vulnerabilities that you might find. So it is quite minimal that you are able, but you can do something around these kinds of, then it's not a complete pen test, I would call it, but it is something around technical assessments that you can do on the public cloud offering when it comes to BTP or so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay, that's very good. Then timelines and reporting requirements. And I mentioned a few slides ago that there are stringent reporting requirements. And this is not a comprehensive list. I can't give you a comprehensive list, but I also wanted to show you that there is a spectrum of reporting. So everything from 24 hours, I'm not even going to mention PCI that actually has no requirement to notify. But if we go NIST 2, 24 hours, all the way to HIPAA 60 days, you see there's quite a spectrum, and each of these have specific reporting requirements. And the one that we wanted to focus on today is the SEC reporting requirement. So that's 4 business days of determining a material incident. And
Wow.
this is quite complex because what is a material incident? How do you define that? The Digital Directors Network has developed this fantastic decision chart that helps you to navigate and determine the materiality, because it's not only qualitative but quantitative as well. And you need to figure that all out, take it through the decision tree, and then you come up with an answer. Is this material, and has it been reported properly? And there's a lot of requirements there. So it's good, and there's a very specific spreadsheet there that you can actually download from their website. And if you need help, you should get an expert to help you as well.
When we are, there may be a question that I also come across here when it comes to these different requirements by different regulatory bodies. Does the actual impact or the severity of an incident has any decision on how or when you are reporting, or all of that? Like, as you said, what is a material incident? Does any other regulatory, like NIST, what else do we have here? UK ICO, does it have also these requirements, or?
Yes, yes. And some of
Okay,
them are specific to data privacy. So
okay.
any leak of private data is considered uh, significant. But some of them, like the US SEC one, it actually has to go through an assessment to determine the impact, and then it needs to be reported accordingly. HIPAA is also focusing around patient data. That one, you can see there more than 500 records. It needs to be reported within a certain time frame. Otherwise, GDPR is pretty stringent as well. So most of the data privacy requirements have these requirements to be very quick. And you can see as Cercia that I mentioned, it's mentioned twice on this list because first for a ransomware payment.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the reporting is encouraged, but it's still voluntary. And you see then 72 hours for reasonably believing that something is happening. Yeah. So that's around critical infrastructure. So steps to mitigate the risks. So, what does it mean for an SAP system at the end of the day? Regular patching and updates, segmentation and zero trust, monitoring and detection, user access control, setting it up properly the first time around, training and awareness, pen testing your SAP servers. And don't believe that the normal pen tests that you do on every server at the same time is going to be specific enough. SAP has specific weaknesses, specific ports that are open. The attack surface is very different. So you should have a specialized pen test for an SAP system. And I'm sure that Wasim is going to tell us that the No Monkey Academy and advisory services can help here.
Absolutely, especially when they are, integrated together, because at the end of the day, whether we are doing a pen test and how we can, let's say, report these findings for the also cyber team to understand, it is an important part where those different aspects of academy, whether it is the different trainings that we are providing, and one of the trainings is we will show next, which is your training around compliance. And definitely when it comes to advisory is how we can support on a long term customers with an SAP security roadmap or a strategy that we create together, which brings the steps on how we can, of course, put these together just shortly in a few minutes, so you could understand the entire thing, how it works together with advisory and academy. But back to the course, there is definitely a course around what Barry's been discussing. He's giving us a small tips and small hints around what is available in this course. Maybe Barry, anything here to add around what learners might find in this course that they can register for?
Yeah, so I've given you the introduction to the course,
Sure.
which is this presentation, and it's just going to take you a little bit deeper and talk a lot more about some of these concepts and how to put together that framework, and also what to look out for, and covering the major jurisdictions, the US, the EU, and Switzerland. But you would have to consider some of the others as well. We are hoping to expand with, we're already brainstorming a few more courses. So we're looking at bringing out courses pretty soon on auditing, internal auditing, some of these processes as well.
Absolutely. And we'd love to hear if there's any feedback on specific areas that we are trying to work on different courses, as Barry said. But it would be definitely valuable if there's some stuff that we also might include in our pool of courses. To get an idea also of how things work between the academy and advisory, we definitely, whether it is around compliance, whether it is around the enablement of your SOC, for instance, team, doing that security assessments, of course, this is always going to be where we are defining those objectives and requirements with the different stakeholders, and then starting to create the SAP security roadmap that is based on these objectives, but also in parallel, where Academy kicks in, is to find or to define an SAP security training roadmap. So for instance, if you have some sort of objectives and requirements around, what does it mean to my SAP system around compliance? What does it mean that now I have to be in compliant with NIST 2 or so on? So that roadmap is defined based on the objectives that we first create. And definitely we start integrating, whether it is Barry's course or other people's courses within the academy, throughout that strategy or throughout that interaction that we have with you. And based off of that, we start prioritizing, of course, and allocating those resources so we can together work on them and start implementing them through a continuous process. Now, we definitely saw a lot of different areas where you cannot, there's limited people inside the team. There is limited, let's say, resources, but it's where we try to help on a longer run. We don't do it for every day of the week, but we try to work together on a monthly basis, 3 times, 4 times once, until we are achieving these objectives that we have set in the first place. So we try to always, let's say, accumulate what our academy and advisory do together, so we can provide that excellence when it is delivering services, or when it is, upskilling or knowledge transfer around those different requirements that we set up together when it comes to, increasing or maturing the security posture of your SAP environments. And definitely, without a fact, I don't think that we can do this on a let's say a manual basis when it comes to reporting, or when it comes to looking into controls. I think the days of manual work should always be done. This is where technology definitely will help. So creating that continuous monitoring around your baseline, where these controls are missing, where they are not missing. As you know, there are different SAP applications and SAP processes that definitely do require a more severity level, or do require more controls to bring it up to that level that you require. So when it comes to how everything would work together from the operation level to an executive level, to then hopefully the board level with the idea of managing risk, it's where your operational level
tries to identify and validate different threats that are happening across your business processes with specific business owners. So that's an important part, to remove that silo that is there. And based off of that, the analysis that is done there, or the risk analysis with those key stakeholders, these are then definitely going into that executive level. So it is a continuous process where the support is provided, where you are validating all of this, but also definitely at the end of the day, you will need something to keep on watching it. Because as I said, and it's an important part, that manual work is really going to take a lot out of your time. So continuously or automating that process later on would definitely support in ongoing or in improving your security posture. So here's some takeaways before I give Barry the last few words from his side. But a few takeaways here: definitely look into deriving your roles and responsibilities. Now we are, in an era where we have to move, or SAP customers have to move to the cloud soon. You need to define those roles and responsibilities, and don't do it before a transformation project. Don't do it during, do it literally when you are in that discovery phase. So you could understand, where's your risk, what is threats, where are your people who are responsible for what exactly. And of course, the new regulation, as we've heard from Barry, such as the NIST, does now include a lot of different industries. So it's not just now your financial industries, it's your food and beverage industries, it's your automotive industries, who had also other regulations that you need to take care of. And then, of course, this is an important area where you need to shift what you are doing from a technical perspective into creating that translation into organizational risk. So your business impact analysis would definitely here play a big role in making the business understand what happens if this kind of systems go down from a technical perspective, from availability, how much it will lose, as just an example to give out there. 100%, Barry has given us the rundown of the different requirements. Go down to basics, whether it is assess, isolate your entire system, patch your system, improve those different configuration weaknesses, identify and prioritize where you need to improve on, and create that baseline or security baseline that enables you then to actually touch points or touch on different security stuff that will enable you also to advance your security posture. So your baseline needs to be intact all the time, monitored all the time, so you can actually start addressing larger issues when it comes to protecting SAP environments. And without it being said, of course, with all that you are doing, whether technology you're bringing in, those processes, if there is no person to actually, or there is nobody to operate on these, or knowledgeable enough to operate, this is where an important part of upskilling and maturity is necessary. And as you guys all know, I mean, the one of the critical assets within an organization is people, and organization's biggest opportunities is also people. So it is an important part where No Monkey also with Tech Trust brings that knowledge, so you can keep going, or you can utilize the different tools and different new policies around SAP security. And Barry, before we open it up, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think there are two things that are really important. You need to understand the systemic risk. You're no longer living in isolation. Everything is affecting everything else. And the problem might not be with you, as we saw with the CrowdStrike incident. Airlines' health systems were brought down because something was going wrong with Microsoft or somewhere else. And it had an effect in the resilience and the ability to transact in systems like SAP. So you need to consider that. And then you have to keep up to date with the regulatory requirements, and most importantly is the incident response and reporting responsibilities, because there are severe penalties for getting that wrong. So keep your eye on that, and that could be from an SAP system.
Absolutely. And again, thank you, Barry. Thank you for the audience. I think this is definitely worth repeating. But for everyone that is in the crowd or whoever's going to watch it later, it is a pleasure of ours to have you, Barry, representing No Monkey with Tech Trust in Switzerland. And of course, for Swiss companies, for the Swiss professionals, organizations there that do need that assistance, advice, Barry is there definitely to provide you. And of course, with No Monkey's support, with the required support and advisory that is required. So I think we're on time, but I would like to open it up for questions if we have any. If not, I believe we can close it out.
Any questions?
Looking forward for the report. Okay. Thank you, Oza.
Yep.
I think we are clear then to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.